Okay, so I'm going to try and do this Pachachka style, and is that now running? So I'm into my time already, okay. So what I want to talk about is not so much the bits and bytes, but the philosophy behind what we're doing, the responsibility that we have. I'd like to start out by looking at different ways of change. So this is the Battle of Crécy, 1346. We've got a few thousand English troops against a much greater French force, 10, 20,000 French. And the English won. Why did they win? Because they had longbows, and it was raining. The French had crossbows, and crossbow, you can only pull it back so far. So they couldn't adapt. There was a change that you have to get with, or it's going to sweep you past. 100 years later, you've got students in universities throughout Europe studying in much the way that they would normally do, their books, they're listening to a professor. But what about the books? Where are they getting the books from? Well, they're getting the books, they're being produced by... It does work if you point at the slides in Pachachka, it's good. They're being produced by monks in scriptoriums. These monks would produce these marvelous books. They'd work on them slowly, day by day, illustrating them, copying them. They were absolutely beautiful. It would take an entire lifetime sometimes to produce a Bible. Maybe they might manage to get to work on 2 in a lifetime. But that was a piece of work that was just accepted as that's how you produce it. And of course, the books that they produce today are works of art. They're collector's pieces. That's great, but really we don't want to pay that much for a book. But everything changes 100 years after the Battle of Crécy, when Gutenberg invents the printing press. And today this seems very, very obvious. Clearly that's how you would produce books. You wouldn't sit there and produce them longhand over a lifetime. And books are so much a part of what we do. Of course, that's changing as well, but with Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, and we see the printing press here, everything changes in terms of production rates. This is the start of an amazing explosion of data and availability. And I like to look at these old pictures of the printing press and look at the fact that there's a case off to the side of the press itself holding the letters for the movable type. And in the uppercase, they have the capital letters, and in the lowercase, they have the lower ones. That's why we call them upper and lowercase today. But this is the first big data explosion. You've got a few million books at the start of the Elizabethan age, and hundreds of millions of books at the end of the Elizabethan age. And they had just as much of a problem figuring out how to handle this big data explosion as we do today. Now, fortunately, in those days, everything was run by the church, and so it was pretty easy. You cataloged stuff as the sacred and the profane. I mean, what could be harder than that? That works for a little while. It's not essentially what we would call today scalable, but at least it did kind of work for them. Once they started to run into problems, they bring in the big thinkers of the day, and you say, okay, well, what are we going to do with this cataloging problem? Francis Bacon comes along and says, well, you know, sacred and profane is not going to work. Let's have a more detailed cataloging system, and he adds poesy to the set of catalogs. What the heck's poesy? Basically poetry. It was a major form of printed work at that time, was that. But nobody was too worried about this. Yes, you know, you get into big questions about how the cataloging goes. It keeps on going along. Dewey versus Cutter in terms of whether or not we have the Dewey Decimal System or the Cutter system. Dewey said, let's just figure out catalogs for everything, and we'll subdivide from there. Cutter says, let's just catalog what's in the library. Of course, we all know that Dewey eventually wins, but nobody's really getting displaced. It's not in their face. It's not a big problem for an established industry. Now, maybe that's changing as well as we all buy Kindles and iPads and the bookstore starts to disappear, which will make me very sad, by the way. There's nothing I like better than to sit in a nice comfy chair, some cookies, a drink, and a book. You know, this is definitely my comfort zone. But we recognize that it's a change that we can adapt to gradually. But let's fast forward a few hundred years more to find out the third model of reacting to change. Jacquard invents the Programmable Loom. And this is programmed with punch cards, which inspired Babbage to build the difference engine, which then inspired Alan Turing to start coming up with the Turing Test and inventing artificial intelligence. The picture of Jacquard there was actually woven on one of those looms. But what you find is that this displaces workers, industrial workers, and they don't like it one little bit. So you have the Luddite Revolution This strange-looking person is Ned Ludd. And the British had more troops fighting the Luddites, who were trying to smash the machines of industrial production, than they did to have troops fighting Napoleon on the continent. So, big, big pushback. Today, what's happening? Well, we have Russ building his square telescope, a square kilometer array telescope, and massive amounts of data coming. Well, that doesn't seem very frightening. I mean, it's a bit challenging, but it's not terribly frightening. But really, to get through that data set, we have to develop artificial intelligence. Because without artificial intelligence, we're not going to get in there. Now, some of you are chuckling because you saw Watson, the IBM supercomputer, playing Jeopardy on TV. And it was really, really cool. I studied AI back in Edinburgh in the 70s. And I would have assumed that we would have this by the 80s. And clearly, I was very, very wrong on that one. But in terms of passing the Turing Test, Alan Turing said that if you can't tell the difference between the responses of a person and a machine, you must either conclude that the machine is intelligent or that the person is not. And I'm sure we know some people who might fail the Turing Test. But that aside, clearly we're getting to the point where the Turing Test is indeed being passed by machines. And that's a little scary, but you know, as long as it's some computer somewhere in a lab, well, we're not going to be too scared about that either. We can accept that. But here's an interesting little critter. This is called a sea squirt. Now, what's that got to do with anything? A sea squirt lives most of its life swimming around the ocean as a little larval thing. But one time in its life, it starts to mature, it finds a rock, it anchors on its rock, and it's going to be there for the rest of its life as this rather pretty-looking, spongy thing. The first thing it does for nutrition, it eats its brain. Why does it do that? Because you don't need a brain if you don't move around. Only things that move around and sense their environment have brains in the natural world. So when we have robots that are standing on a production line, again, they're not too scary. But once they start moving around, whether it's our little robot vacuum cleaner, or the military robots, or the drones, they become a little scary. And so those of us who perhaps don't want jobs looking like we're already human robots, who want to have better, more enriching lives, we're going to have to say, do we want the machines to put us here? Do we? I think we probably don't. What we probably want is to have fulfilling jobs doing interesting, high-tech things, doing some of the things that you hear about at conferences like this. So I'm about to hit my last slide in my Pachachka, but I have the advantage over the Pachachka people last night of still having a couple of minutes on the clock over here. So if that's not too much cheating, I want to just sort of make you think about this. How are we going to react to this brave new world of big data, of artificial intelligence, of robotics that we see coming along? What are we going to think when the sequencing that Andrew talked about yesterday at his keynote allows us to produce amazing new life forms, to knock out personal medicine? How are we going to think when the computers know so much about us, as we've seen from the analysis that Hillary was talking about through the Bitly piece? Something as simple as a URL shortener. Are we going to say, this is a change that's absolutely in our face and we have to deal with it right now? Well, no, it's not like the Battle of Crecy. Is it something like, the invention of the printing press? Well, I would say it's kind of like that. But once the robots start moving around, is it going to feel like this threatening industrial machines? I would say that along the theme of leadership in the age of big data, it's up to all of us who are in privileged positions to attend conferences like this and other ones like it, where we get together with thought leaders in the space to help everybody else that we deal with who are not in this space understand the changes that are coming, think about what they mean, really think through the implications. Because one thing's for sure, even if we decide that this is scary stuff, we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. That telescope's going to be built, the data's going to be available, Hillary's going to know what we're doing, Andrew's going to produce weird and wonderful life forms, other people are going to produce the robots. It's going to happen. But if we've thought it ahead, then we don't have to be scared by it. We can embrace it, we can say we understand, we see the pitfalls are there, we can avoid that one, we see the advantages are here, and maybe we're going to run into trouble every now and again. But this is a technology that promises so much. If we use it right, we're going to do well. We mustn't let our fellow citizens be scared of it, be frightened by what they see and don't understand. It's up to all of us to be advocates for this technology as well as engineers of it. Thank you.